SECfans.com coming at you again, Ohio State fans. And for the first time this year, Wisconsin fans, we've covered y'all in the past, but I think it was for the Alabama game a while back. I don't remember. Anyway, Ohio State fans are used to our formula. Wisconsin fans, we're going to introduce you to our computer model later on in the discussion. But we've got to talk about this game. It's massive, massive, massive. We thought Ohio State was out of the playoff hunt, but there's still some chatter that they can work themselves back in. Like Bama, I think they need a little bit of chaos at the top. Unlike Bama, they're actually playing on Saturday to add another resume notch. So we're not going to rile up the Ohio State fans too much about the whole SEC thing and whether or not they deserve it over them, over Alabama. We won't go there. But what we will do is break down this game, talk about what we've seen from both teams this year, how they're going to match up, and later on, not too much later on because we're trying to get into it really quick, we're going to get into our computer model that breaks down basically what we think we're going to see in this game. So let's talk about this, Ohio State and Wisconsin. The direction I'm going to go first is Wisconsin because we started off with a Wisconsin team probably through the first half of the season that was playing a lot with the analogy that I like to give, that 2012 Notre Dame factor where they had a lot of trash on their schedule and they were winning, but they looked awful in a lot of these games. We're talking about one-score games against really bad teams. But second half of the year, that hasn't been what we've seen from Wisconsin. We've seen Wisconsin take care of business. We've seen Wisconsin handle not only the trash, but actual good teams. They had a little scare against Michigan, but look, Michigan's a good team. They gave Ohio State a scare last weekend too. So that's not a team that you're necessarily expected to blow out by 50 points. You're happy with a win. I know Ohio State fans would love to do it every year. So let's talk a little bit about this Wisconsin team first. Ohio State fans know what we think about their team so far. We've been pretty high on them all year. Do you think Wisconsin has kind of turned the corner in terms of sort of shaken off that not playing great against crappy teams and it has hit their identity? Or is there some hidden concern there in the mix still lingering?
The funny thing to me is Wisconsin, in some ways, has been worse in the second half of the season. It's just they've been more productive in those games. And we track per play stats. It's really important when you're judging teams like Ohio State and Wisconsin because in Wisconsin's case, you don't run a lot of plays. And if you don't run a lot of plays, a lot of times you look at scores and go, man, they only scored 31 points in a 31-14 win over Florida Atlantic. It's like, well, of course they did. Didn't run a lot of snaps. It didn't have a ton of possessions. Were they dominant? No, not necessarily. But when you don't run a lot of plays, games tend to be a little closer. We talk a lot about how if you're a really dominant team, the more you extend the game, it's like dice rolls. If I know, let's say if I roll a 1 or a 2, I win. And if I roll a 3 to a 6, the house wins. If I roll that dice once, I've got about a 1 in 3 chance of winning. If I run that dice 50 times, it's almost non-existent. So, with Wisconsin, they've had some close games and not close games, but everything's kind of squashed together, and it makes the bad patches stand out more because they don't have 15 possessions where they can have 6 bad possessions and sort of turn it around in the last 9. Then, maybe they only have 10. And if you have 6 bad possessions out of 10, now all of a sudden it looks much more like a struggle win than a team like Louisville that we're often very critical of because they'll go long stretches in a game, play very poorly, but they just have the ball so much that nobody ever sees it in the final stat sheet. But to finish the point here, Wisconsin consistently averaged over 6 yards per play to the beginning of the season. In fact, through their first 7 games, they were over 6 yards per play in 6 of the 7. The one exception was the Northwestern win, but outside that, Utah State, Florida Atlantic, BYU. Utah State, BYU, and Nebraska, they were over 7 yards per play, and right at that mark with Purdue, 6.96. Since that point, in the last 5 games, where everyone now feels like they've turned the corner, they haven't hit 6 yards per play, which they'd hit every game prior. They were only 4.73 yards per play against Illinois. That is not a great mark. 5.5 against Indiana, 5.7 against Iowa, 5.5 against Michigan. And then I will say they went right back up to 7.6 against Minnesota, so I'll take that back a little bit. But in that 4-game stretch, to a certain extent, the opponents were better, but I think the biggest thing is the games lasted a little longer. They leaned on the run more, but they scored 38 points against Iowa, and they scored 38 points off 5.7 yards per play. They scored 38 points against Nebraska, but they did that with 7 yards per play. And I think a lot of it had to do with the length of the game and the way the game played out, the crispness of it. Explosive offense is important. They've been a little bit better at hitting big plays. And we talked about this with Michigan, last week, and we'll get in a minute. I really want to talk about how the model did last week against Ohio State, Michigan, because I think it was very telling. We said that the Ohio State Michigan game was going to look like the Indiana game. And the reason for that is Michigan, if they can stymie you up front, they do really well defensively. But their back seven gives up a lot of really big plays. And so Wisconsin didn't have a phenomenal yard per play average, 5.5 yards per play. But what they were really good at is they got some explosive plays that they turned into points. And explosive plays, if you have an 80-yard touchdown pass, that's 80 yards converted directly into points. And most of the time when you have a field position game and you're moving the ball a little bit, you get a lot of yards that don't really directly turn into points. And what they've done over the course of the year is early in the year, they were dominant in a per play stance and they were very, very good in a lot of ways, but they just weren't producing because they didn't have a lot of explosive offense. Later in the season, they may not be completely explosive, but they're doing a much better job of taking their production and turning it into touchdowns, turning it into field goals. And that's why Wisconsin looks so much better. It's not necessarily that the team is more dominant, because in a lot of ways they're not. It's that the team is actually executing when they need to and how they need to win ball games.
Sometimes we go straight into the numbers. Before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about matchups, and this is how we're going to bring Ohio State into this. I know there's some concerns about JT Barrett, and there's been some concerns about Ohio State's defense, although the big number they gave up to Iowa is more indicative of offensive struggles than their defense. But what we said consistently throughout the year is that Ohio State is a very good, if not elite, run defense. I know some of that may have waned a little bit through the end of the season, but they held, they've held multiple really good running backs to well below their season averages, which fits in line with the numbers that we provide. So in comes Jonathan Taylor with Wisconsin, and we know how much he means to this team. You said earlier in one of our earlier shows where we did Alabama or Auburn, Georgia, that if Kerryon Johnson doesn't play, even though he's not an elite running back, and Taylor is, if Kerryon Johnson doesn't play, he means so much to that offense that they're not even going to win the game against a team that they just blew out. We flip this over to Wisconsin, where their entire identity is through Taylor, and they don't have nearly as dynamic a pass game as Auburn, if we're using them as an example. So, one, do you think that Ohio State and that impressive run defense is going to be able to slow him down? And how much do they need to slow him down to completely shut down this offense?
Well, first off, I'll note that Ohio State's run defense is falling off statistically in our model. They're down to 72% of opponent rush averages. They were better earlier in the year. And so I think the first thing there to sort of appreciate is the fact that they're very, very good, but they're not quite the elite unit they were. They're still a very, very good unit, but I don't think they're quite good enough to dominate Wisconsin up front. But if they do, obviously it's going to matter. Obviously, Wisconsin is a run play action team. And when you look at the numbers for these two teams, it's actually pretty crazy how much they're still to run to the pass. But in Wisconsin's case, it's almost 2-1. So when you're that sort of, dominant or stuck to it, then everything you do is predicated on the run. And every pass they make is predicated on the run. In that Iowa game that Ohio State lost, they lost it in large part, and it's hard to say the interplay of it because it was both sides. They lost it because Iowa was passing the ball pretty successfully, and because they were passing it successfully, Iowa was able to run the ball for 38 times for 243 yards. And that just kind of put them off balance. It didn't let them get in a rhythm. They couldn't win the game. And, Bosa goes out of that game too. So I think Wisconsin has to have a run game. And if they have a run game, they can make things work. And I think what's more important, though, is to have a run game, they've got to have a passing game. It's got to complement each other. And at times, Hornibrook has been able to do that. And he was able to do, 81% passing against Minnesota. And he was efficient when he needed to be against Michigan. But he was still sub 50% passer against Michigan. So, I think it's an interesting question. I don't think Ohio State will be able to completely shut down Wisconsin. I think if they did, and Hornibrook had to be a pass-first quarterback, this game is probably over, frankly. But if Wisconsin can get 4+ yards per carry, then that allows their passing game to be a complementary passing game. And what we've seen from Ohio State is that if they can't protect their corners and their edge players, they're pretty vulnerable. So I think that's sort of my answer, that Ohio State won't shut it down entirely. And I think the model backs that up. The model has them at 3.8 yards per carry predicted. But if that number climbs, and I said 4, but probably about 4.5 yards per carry, the worm turns, so to speak, and the game changes, and Wisconsin suddenly can start using the play action game and start extending drives with simple throws, because I do think you can exploit Ohio State's corners.
All right, so since we're already talking about numbers, let's get into the model. For Wisconsin fans who aren't familiar, and for Ohio State fans that maybe need a little primer, go 90 seconds on what the model is, and then tell us what the model says about this game.
So our model is a per-play based model that looks at historical data and comes up with some intermediate metrics that say, okay, this is how you did against your opponents. This is how well your opponents did against everyone else. So how are you doing against your opponent's averages? So it's an entirely opponent strength relative set of metrics that's entirely historical. I don't have any of my own subjective constants applied or anything like that. I take that, I generate some predictions on how your yardage is going to go to in the game based off your strengths and weaknesses versus your opponent's strengths and weaknesses. It's totally a matchup based model. And then based off that, from the yardage prediction, I look at your past history, and I'll look at each individual's team's past history and go, okay, if this is the kind of yardage you're getting, what is a projection for the amount of points you score with that yardage? And in that projection, that's where you account for things like turnovers and efficiency and field goal percentage and all that kind of thing. So last week, I said I wanted to talk about this, and I'll hit on it just briefly. Our model predicted Ohio State 31, Michigan 17. Of course, that score was Ohio State 31, Michigan 20. It predicted that Ohio State was going to have 5.78 yards per play. Ohio State had 5.56 yards per play. So just to sort of give a baseline, that's pretty darn accurate, and it's pretty consistent, and it's had a pretty good ping on the Ohio State game. I think you said that, if I remember right, when we did the Ohio State-Penn State game, we called that game was going to be very high scoring because the matchups were a problem for both teams. Penn State against the run was quite poor. Ohio State had real susceptibility against the pass. So we predicted we'd go back and forth. We predicted that that Ohio State would outgain Penn State, but Penn State would be able to score more points from their yardage. And I think if Penn State made the final field goal, I think we even would have had the exact score, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, they got the ball on like the 38, 40-yard line, couldn't drive to get in field goal range, but had they made that 30 yards or whatever they needed and kick a field goal, the model would have predicted the exact score.
So that's how it works. And what we're very good at is sort of understanding how matchups work, understanding how yardage sort of plays out in terms of points for different teams. And it does a pretty good job comparatively of saying, if both teams play their average game, this is a straight objective statistic to say this is what the average game looks like for both teams. And I say all that to say, okay, we've talked about the matchups. I talked about Ohio State's rush defense. I beat that to death. 72% of opponent averages. Wisconsin's rush defense, though, 64% of opponent averages. Both these pass defenses are about the same. 86% of opponent averages for Ohio State, 83% for Wisconsin. But what is being overplayed is how good Ohio State's run defense is against Wisconsin. What is being underplayed is how good Wisconsin's run defense is, which is at 64%. That is an elite run defense, which I said Ohio State isn't quite as good. 10 percentage points better than Ohio State. This model predicts Ohio State will run the ball worse than Wisconsin, under 3 yards per eight, about 3.8 yards per carry for both teams, but a little bit better for Wisconsin. But the edge here is due to one, the relative strength of pass defenses. Wisconsin's pass defense is better than Ohio State's due to the fact that Wisconsin's passing offense has been per play better than Ohio State's. That kind of makes up the difference, and it predicts 5.2 yards per play for Wisconsin, 5.1 for Ohio State. Close margin, but when you pull it all out, it predicts Wisconsin 31, Ohio State 27. So the same model that has predicted very close to correct scores for Ohio State in the previous two games predicts Wisconsin to win.
So for me, I don't think this is crazy. I know our model is, our model's going against Vegas. Vegas right now has Ohio State open. I think they're laying 6.5 point favorite, and Vegas is feeling pretty good about themselves because they're going to say, okay, your model was great, whatever. We had the line perfect last week in the Michigan game. So for me, though, I look at an Ohio State team that had some struggles with Michigan, a Wisconsin team that had some struggles with Michigan. But Michigan's success against Wisconsin was more of some one-off chunk shot plays, whereas Michigan's success against Ohio State was more consistent. Now, O'Korn didn't do great, 6.1 yards per attempt, but he's a horrible quarterback. Nobody's going to be offended that's watching this video. The guy's terrible. I don't think you have a whole lot of dynamic play at quarterback or just in that pass game in general for Wisconsin, but I think it's a considerable step up, and it goes from being a liability to a supplement to that running game at Wisconsin. Evans, without the help of an even decent quarterback, Evans went for 6.1 yards per carry, Higdon 5 per attempt. All that to say, I know we're looking at kind of a transitive property, one game, plucking one game out. All that to say, I kind of agree with the model. And I'm going to go with Wisconsin in this game. I'm going to go I don't think it's going to be very high scoring. I think it's going to go a little different than some of the other Ohio State games this year, especially Penn State. I'm going to go 24-20. Same margin, different lower score, 24-20 for Wisconsin over Ohio State. And Ohio State fans are going to be upset because we're picking against their team and we've been pretty good to them this year. But remember, Ohio State fans, if we're SEC fans and we're trying to get that second team in, we're trying to get Alabama in the playoff, we need you to win and win close, win and not get in the playoffs yourselves. But if Wisconsin wins, it probably spells absolute doom for the SEC getting two teams in, and we're still saying, or at least I'm still saying, I think Wisconsin wins 24-20 for me. Now tell me, are you going to deviate from the model? I know when we did Ohio State, Penn State, I picked Ohio State, you picked Penn State. Are you going to pick against Ohio State again, or are you going to go against the model?
I am going to pick against Ohio State again, and one caveat here: the model has Ohio State predicted with 27 points. That is more points than anyone scored against Wisconsin all season. Their worst game was 24 points, and Northwestern was the only team to score 20 points. Over 17. So that you have to understand, though the schedule has not been very good, Wisconsin's done everything you can ask defensively, and Ohio State's offense, when they've played better teams, has stalled. Now, the other problem with all of this is, going back to what I said earlier, Wisconsin doesn't play a lot of drives. So I think this game's going to be shorter than one would anticipate. And a lot of times when you watch these games go really slow, people get really frustrated. They feel like the offense isn't moving the ball. And we've talked a couple different games this year, and I think the biggest one was Alabama-Tennessee, where a lot of Alabama fans were frustrated with their first half performance. And we said, okay, well, look at the way this actually played out. You only had 5 possessions in an entire half. They scored on 3 of the 5 possessions. This game's going to be similar in a lot of ways because Both these teams are going to run the ball a ton. It's going to cause the clock to burn quickly. Because the clock burns quickly, they're going to take more TV timeouts. And in real time, they're not going to score very fast because it's going to take a lot of real time to score. But in terms of plays, they're not going to run a ton of plays. They're not going to have a ton of possessions. That's going to lower the final score. So I think the model is right in terms of per play production. I think it's wrong on score. I'm going to go lower like you. I have Wisconsin 21-17. I'm just going to shave 10 points off both teams. But here's a caveat. I picked Penn State last time they played. But as we said, we beat the spread in that game, but we were off on the winner. And the reason being, when you have a score that's that close, it's a coin flip. And you're talking about one drive that's going to decide the game. But when you get in a score that's under 20 points, now it's really a coin flip because we're saying Ohio State, in my case, only scores 2 touchdowns. If they get a kick return, if they get a fumble return, if they get an interception return for a touchdown, that's a 7-point swing and they win the game. So it is very close. This is a very low confidence pick. Anytime it's below 25 points, I don't care how good the teams are that's involved, is too much variability when the score gets that low. I do have Wisconsin, but I think this is a very close game that could easily go either way. I just think it's interesting that our model that has been very good with Ohio State all year does have Wisconsin as the favored team in the ballgame.
Yeah, and you said we picked against Ohio State. No, you in the model. If you meant you in the model, sure. But
I did. I don't really consider you
I picked Ohio State
a meaningful part of this discussion, right?
That's fair. I'm just here to set up you in the model. Okay, so I think the takeaway though from this game is we all three of us expect the game to be really close. And if it is like you said, I know some people who probably haven't seen us a whole lot. We do talk in other videos a whole lot about how variability is pretty high and randomness is pretty high when your scores are very low. So both low scores and shortened games give the opportunity for the lesser team, whomever that is in this scenario, the lesser team a greater opportunity to win. And I think we're going to see some of that here where both of us have a pretty low score. If Wisconsin is running the ball, and look, Ohio State's going to have to run the ball too, it might end up being a short game, which means if it's a short game under 20, under 23, kind of all bets are off. But it'll be interesting to see because we've done really well against the spread this year. 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago accepted. But this one is going in the opposite direction of the spread by pretty healthy. I think 4 points is pretty healthy. So it's interesting to see where we'll be on that.